Sports are back. The NBA began its seeding games in Orlando this weekend after a 4-month break. I will give you my initial takeaways from the exciting opening weekend and tell you which teams are the true championship contenders. And baseball is back, both multiple outbreaks less than 2 weeks into the season. Just how long will it survive? I will discuss the MLB's current situation and why the NFL might be destined to repeat the MLB's mistakes. So sit back, relax, and take a seat. Courtside. Welcome to episode 41 of Courtside. I am your host, Andrew Cohen. Sports are back, and Courtside is back and better than ever. New cover art, new social media content that you will see beginning today, and there is more on the way. As the podcast grows, I'll be able to do some really cool things in terms of visual content with photos, graphics, maybe some video, potentially having a true video version of the podcast where you can actually see me talking on platforms that support it. I might be able to have guests on the show consistently, and I'm currently working on a website where I will be able to include consistent content outside of just the podcast episodes. So if any or all of that sounds exciting to you, then I would really appreciate it if you could go subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening, follow the podcast on social media, links will be in the description, and share the podcast with a friend. With that out of the way, let's start talking about some sports, and I want to start off with the NBA bubble restart, my first impressions of that. Listen, basketball is being played at a very high level. Once again, I've been watching a bunch of these games. I've seen the highlights of pretty much every game at this point. A lot of the games I've seen, they've been close, intense games. They feel like they have a playoff atmosphere. Because, I mean, listen, besides the Bucks and the Lakers, and I guess if you want to include the Wizards in that, you can. But besides those teams, every team has a chance to move up or down in the standings. You have teams in the West currently not in the playoffs, trying to get into the playoffs. So every game is really important. And I'm really excited to see just how intense some of these playoff games can get. Because without fans, you wonder, is it possible for the NBA playoffs this year to match that intensity of playoffs in years past? And I'm really curious to see how that plays out. In terms of the presentation, I think it's been really well done. There's crowd noise being pumped in, but it doesn't feel overdone. I really enjoy the virtual fans too. I saw Chris Bosh during the Lakers-Clippers game opening night. I saw Paul Pierce and Jason Tatum's son during the Celtics vs. Blazers game on Sunday. It's fun. It's a really fun aspect of these games. It's a small thing, but it's a cool thing to have. Listen, the teams and the players are buying into this bubble, it appears. I've really enjoyed players like Matisse Thybulle and JaVale McGee making vlogs, posting them to YouTube. It's a really cool thing. And most importantly, no positive tests so far. I'm really confident that this season will be able to be played through, and the playoffs will get through and will crown a champion at the end of it all. I have three main basketball takeaways from this weekend. Number one was that Rockets-Mavericks game on Friday night. Rockets win 153-149 in overtime. They were actually forced overtime on a missed free throw tip-in by Robert Covington at the end of regulation. This was a really fun game to watch between two of the best, not two of the best, the two best offensive teams in the league. They are one. The Mavs and Rockets are 1 and 2 respectively in team offensive rating this year, but they're also two of the worst teams in terms of defensive rating among the teams that are going to make the playoffs. In fact, if the season ended today, they would be the two worst teams in terms of team defensive rating among all the playoff teams. And that's really their flaw, right? I mean, 300 total points scored in this one. You look at the Rockets and you're just kind of like, they're going to run into a team that's not going to let Daniel House score 20 points, right? The Mavericks are going to run into a team that's not going to allow Trey Burke to score 31 points off the bench. And to go back to the Rockets, their success really relies on how well they can shoot. I mean, we've seen, obviously, different team year to year, but we've seen playoff games in the past where they struggle to make any sort of three-point shot and they're just getting blown out. These two teams, really good offensively, but that defense, I think, is going to hinder them from making a deep postseason run. Second takeaway from the weekend, 76ers, they still look like a mess. They really have not changed since the season was suspended back in March. Against the Pacers on Friday, Joel Embiid had an amazing game, 41 points, 21 rebounds. Tobias Harris had 30 points. But then you also had Joel Embiid and Shake Milton getting into a heated argument on the sidelines. You had Milton, Richardson, Al Horford, they're struggling. TJ Warren traded for cash considerations this past offseason from the Suns to the Pacers, scores 53 points. And the Sixers lose to the Pacers without Domantas Sabonis and Malcolm Brogdon, two of their three best players. And by the way, the two teams were tied for the 5th seed heading into this one. And so it's a huge game for both teams. The Sixers on paper should win it with the injuries to the Pacers, and yet Pacers win. So Sixers have a lot of talent, but they just can't seem to be able to put it all together. And I think they're a team that could be bounced out in the first round pretty easily. Now, finally, I want to talk about my NBA Finals contenders. I see 5 teams with a true chance to get to the finals. Lakers and Clippers in the West, Bucks and Celtics in the East. And you know what? I think the Raptors can make some noise in the East. I really do. Now, for most of those teams, it's pretty simple why they have a chance at making the finals and potentially winning it. Lakers have LeBron and Anthony Davis. Clippers have Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and an amazing supporting cast. The Bucks have Giannis, Chris Middleton. The Celtics have 4 guys that you would not be shocked they all scored 20 points in the same game, with Kemba Walker, Gordon Hayward, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown. And they were almost able to beat the Bucks on Friday night with Kemba Walker only playing 20 minutes, Jason Tatum having one of the worst games of his career with 5 points, 2 of 18 from the field, and yet they almost were able to beat the Bucks. Now with the Raptors, they continue to impress me though. They were impressing me before the season was suspended, and that win against the Lakers the other night, also another really impressive win. I'm not sure if they have what it takes to beat Milwaukee or Boston in a 7-game series, especially without home court advantage that they would have had against the Celtics normally. But I think how they're going to have to win a series, because they're not going to go in and sweep either of those teams. They're not going to win in 5 games. They're going to need to get it to a 7-game series, force a Game 7, get it to that 1-game situation. I think they have a shot at beating the Bucks or the Celtics at that point. That's how they're going to have to get there. That's how they're going to have to win those series. But I do think the Raptors have a chance at getting to the NBA Finals once again. Things are not looking good for Major League Baseball right now. The MLB did not go with a bubble for this season because the Players Association denied the league's request to explore that option. I blame the players for that, obviously. The NBA and NHL, both in bubbles, have not seen any positive tests within their bubbles so far. And so it feels like, again, so far, that the bubble format is the best way to play a professional sports season this year, if it's possible. Because, listen, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, you couldn't have an MLB bubble. Too many people, too many players, too many staff members, just it wouldn't have worked. Here's a thought. In baseball this season, teams are only playing teams within their division, and then their National League counterpart division. So you have American League and National League East, Central, West, all paired up. So you have 3 kind of larger divisions. Here's an idea, 3 bubbles. The numbers in each bubble would have been about the same as the NBA bubble. I'm not saying it would have been easy to have 3 separate bubbles, but everyone would have been safer, and the league would have had a much better chance of getting through an entire season, getting through the postseason, and having a World Series champion. Already you have 2 outbreaks. You have one with the Marlins, 21 players and staff members infected with the virus. The MLB investigation says that during the team's trip to Atlanta for a couple exhibition games a couple weeks ago, the Marlins were lax with their COVID protocols, and there were some players that went out or were at the hotel bars. And now you have the Cardinals. They appear to have an outbreak as well. We'll have to see how this situation goes. It's ongoing. There's no report on it yet in terms of how the outbreak occurred. So we'll have to keep watching that. Now, one thing that is kind of, I don't want to say like a positive thing, but, it is a positive thing that the Phillies played the Marlins while several of the Marlins players presumably had the virus, yet no Phillies players have tested positive, and the only positive tests among the team's staff were deemed false positives. And they returned to action tonight against the Yankees. That's a good sign that, okay, maybe team-to-team transmission is unlikely during games. That would be the hope. In fact, also with the Cardinals, they played the Twins this past week. So far, no Twins players have tested positive, and the Twins continue to play their schedule. So there's at least kind of a small positive thing in there that you can at least be, I don't want to say get too confident, but you can at least hope that team-to-team transmission through games is unlikely. Also, what that tells me is the way that a team has an outbreak isn't from playing a game against another team with one player that has it. It's when somebody brings in the virus from the outside and goes to practice and is spreading it around with their teammates. Because think about it, right? If nobody enters the stadium with the virus, no one will get the virus while they're in the stadium. But if someone goes out while they're not at the ballpark, that's where outbreaks can happen. Players need to do everything in their power to minimize the risk of contracting the virus and spreading it to teammates and coaches. There's no other way around it. They're not getting the virus at the ballpark. They're getting it outside and then bringing it into the ballpark. Now, I'm really curious to see how this affects the NFL because, like the MLB, the NFL is not going with a bubble format for 2020, and we've obviously seen how not having a bubble format has worked for the MLB. And it feels like the NFL is doomed to repeat many of the same mistakes as Major League Baseball that have gotten us to the point where baseball might be canceled sometime this week. The NFL has more players and staff on each team. That's more guys with the chance to get the virus, more guys to spread it to, and then more guys for those guys to spread it to. And it feels like the virus will be way more likely to spread in football games than it would in baseball. Right, in baseball, a lot of the time you're not standing right next to somebody, whereas in football you're always standing right next to somebody. Now, on the bright side, teams only play one game per week in the NFL. So the hope is that every team, come Sunday, is able to put an entire team of healthy players on the field. But as much as I want to be optimistic about that, I can't be that optimistic with how things are playing out in baseball right now. Because one of the problems in baseball right now is with testing, because a player can have the virus, right? And they can be tested every other day or whatever, right? But they can have the virus, go to practice, I guess potentially spread it to teammates and coaches, and then the next day get the test results back saying they're positive, but they've already had it for a day, and they've already been spreading it to their teammates. And that, if that happens in the NFL, again, with the numbers there, that's not good. It can't happen. For the NFL to succeed, here's what's going to need to happen. Players, I don't want players to have to be monitored and have a wristband on them and have the coaches and the team know exactly where they are at all times. I don't think that is the way to go about it, but I think you have to be really, really clear about what players can and can't do or should not be doing when they're not on the practice field, not playing a game outside of the stadium. Because you can't have players going out, putting themselves at risk of getting infected, and then going into an environment where there's no social distancing. They don't have to wear masks, right? As thorough as these protocols are within the stadium, if somebody comes in with the virus, it's bound to get spread to somebody, especially in football. You can't have a Marlins situation where a team goes on the road and they're going out and having fun. You can't have that in the NFL because it could be catastrophic. You could wipe out an entire team of players. In baseball, okay, you can find some replacement players, some veterans here and there to add to the team. And listen, when it's a team like the Marlins, one of the worst teams in the league already, it's not as big of a deal as if like the Yankees got it, right? What would the league do right now without Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, Garrett Cole, and the Yankees? With the NFL, listen, it's not ideal to be monitoring every player. It's not ideal to have to always be hammering home the point, don't go out, stay inside, stay in your homes, don't put yourself at risk of getting the virus. I don't know how feasible it is. I don't know if it will work. But that's the best option they have because they're not going into a bubble. I hope the MLB will be okay. I hope the NFL will be okay. But right now, it's hard to be optimistic about the baseball and football seasons this year. Thank you guys so much for tuning to this edition of Courtside. If you enjoyed, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening. Share the podcast with family and friends. I would really, really appreciate it. Make sure to follow the podcast on Instagram and Twitter. Both of those links will be in the description. In the coming days, you're going to see some social media exclusive content. Come back tomorrow for another incredible episode of the Courtside podcast where I will be discussing the NBA Coach of the Year award. Until then, signing off, this is Andrew Cohen. I'll see you next time.